I installed a router and router lift in my table saw extension, and now I need a fence. I made a video covering this homemade fence for my table saw. It has what I call an incremental positioner, which uses a half nut and a threaded rod to move it to the nearest 16th of an inch when you lock it down. I'll leave a link to the video I made about this in the description below. Today I'm building a router table fence, much like the table saw fence, with a T-square design and incremental positioning. I'm starting with 37 1/4 inches of 2-inch square tube, 1/8 inch wall. I'll cut this in the middle at a 26.6 degree angle to give me two 19-inch pieces. First I drill two 1/4 inch holes through both sides of each tube, then enlarge the holes in one side to 37/64 and tap them 5/8 18 threads per inch. These will be used to attach the fence faces. Then I file off any burrs left by the tap. Each fence half gets 3 holes drilled in the top. Then I tap the holes 1/4 20. Until now, one half is a mirror image of the other. Now we'll set this one aside and work only on this one. The straight end of this tube gets a 3/8 plate welded on the bottom. The plate needs to stick past the end by a 1/4 inch. If I were to weld one side solid, then the other, the heat would cause this side to warp and this side would lift up. Instead, I tack all 4 corners before I weld it solid. Next, I'll make an end cap, starting by drilling 2 holes in this piece of 1/4 inch plate. And it gets welded on right here. And let's quick get rid of these ugly welds before anyone sees them. Grind the welds flush or a little below the edge of the tube. And now I can tap the holes in the end cap. Now let's get to work on this, the T-square. It's made from 16 inches of 2 by 2 by 1/4 angle. It gets a hole drilled near each corner, and the holes are tapped 1/4 20. Now I'll drill 2 holes near the middle of this 1/8 inch flat bar. Then I bend the flat bar as shown here. This gets welded to the angle by filling the holes with weld, and an identical one gets welded to the other leg of the angle. I cut up some UHMW plastic, which I'll glue down to the flat bars to help it slide smoother. These are about a 1/16 inch thick, and they get glued down to the squaring flat bars. I also glued down a 1/4 inch piece in the middle of the tube that we set aside earlier. Now I can weld the T-square onto the square tube. I lightly clamp it in place, make sure it's approximately square, then add another clamp. This doesn't have to be perfectly square, but it needs to be pretty close. I need to grind the welds off this side so that it clears the table, and off this side so that it clears the fence face. Now I'll install the adjustment set screws and adjust them to roughly level the fence. Now I need to weld on these 2 flat bars like so. Square tube and another flat bar holds their spacing until I weld them, then grind them flush or a little below. Between these I'm putting an 1/8 inch flat bar spring. It needs 2 holes drilled in it to bolt it to the end cap. Now I'll temporarily bolt it in place. Next I cut a 3/4 16 nut in thirds. Two of the thirds go right behind the spring. I'll temporarily set the fence in place, then I'll mark the height of the nuts on the spring. Now I'll take the spring back off And back at the bench, I'll put the two nuts in place and use a small piece of threaded rod to hold their spacing. I tacked these on. Now I'll check to be sure they're right before I weld them solid. Now I'll start working on the cam. First, I drill a 5/16 hole through a 5/8 shaft at 1/8 inch off center. The cam handle is made from a bolt. I cut the threads off and turn the head into a more comfortable handle. It uses a ball bearing for smoother and easier clamping. The bearing is not a press fit, so I use a chisel to make a slight welt that will hold the bearing on. To mount this, I first determine the position of the hull. Then I can drill one side. And I'll use the cam as a drill guide to drill the other side. If the cam is too tight, you can do this to loosen it. If it's too loose, you can tighten the set screws on the back of the T-square. Finally, bend the flat bar spring a bit to give it its springiness. Reassemble it and try it out. The cam needs something to stop it at its fully locked position. I tacked an 1/8 inch rod in place to do this. I'll weld this little end cap in place, which will help with dust collection later. Now we can put these two together. To do this, I'm using a piece of angle iron. I'll drill 5/16 holes in line with each of the 1/4 inch tapped holes in the square tube. And in line with the 5/8 tapped holes, I'll cut 1¼ inch holes. And deburr those holes. Somehow I managed to get some serious misalignment with these. So to fix that, I'll drill out the 5/16 holes to 3/8. Now I can put this together. But wait, I ought to paint it first. I'll give it all a coat of black paint to match the table saw fence. Alright, now I can assemble this. Actually, I ought to put the fence faces on first. For faces, I'm using these Rockler aluminum extrusions, but you could also use wood faces. To hold these on, I'm using toilet bolts. I want it to be quick and easy to slide these, so I'm using these push-pull toggle clamps to lock the faces. They thread into the 5/8 holes in the back of the fence. I'll check that they're straight up and down, and then I'll use a wrench to tighten the jam nut. I had to make my own wrench because I didn't have one thin enough. Then I'll thread in the toilet bolt and adjust it for the proper tension. Now I'll bolt the two halves of the fence together. Really. And now it's just a matter of fiddling with the bolts and getting it perfectly aligned. To align the fence with the bit, I'll just use the squaring flat bars. But if you have a miter track, you're going to want to move the half nut and spring assembly side to side. And there's the number I'm looking for. The last thing to do is to make a scale and cursor to indicate fence position. I'll drill and tap a hole right here in the side of the square tube. Then I'll thread in a machine screw, and I cut a notch in the end of the stainless steel cursor to bolt it on. Now I'll move the fence to the middle of the bit, and I'll make my 0 mark right there. And I'll continue making marks every 1/16 of an inch. And that's it. It's done. Just a couple of things I wanted to mention. This fence is not limited to 16ths. There I have it locked at a 32nd. There I've moved it by a full 16th. There it's back to the 0. And say I want to just take 5 thousandths. Well, that's right there. If I need to get the fence out of the way for a table saw cut, very easy to just lift it off and move it. Let's test the dust collection. Here I'm taking a 3/8 round over on both sides of a piece of wood with no dust collection connected. And there's how much sawdust that left on the saw. Now making the same cuts again, this time with dust collection connected. And it didn't get 100% of it, but it's better than nothing. Be sure you check out my table saw fence video to learn how to build the rail for this fence. As a bonus, you'll learn how to build the table saw fence. Thank you for watching.